Hey YouTube, Trevor Meredith with Wicked Art Studio. It's kind of funny, I had kind of made my mind up that I would probably never do a tutorial video on painting realistic fire or true flames. But about a month ago, a viewer left a comment on one of my videos. It was from, and I apologize in advance if I get the name wrong, R. Legler. They wrote, "I really like your videos. You do a great job explaining what you're doing. I picked the airbrush back up after about 30 years of not painting, and did I forget how to paint? I would like to see you explain painting true fire with Candy₂O when you have time. Thanks." Well, thank you for watching. Thank you for leaving the comment, and here we go. When you paint fire with water-based paint, it requires a slightly different approach compared to urethanes. Water-based paint does not cover near as fast as urethane, and it doesn't cover quite as well as a urethane, especially if you're working on a dark or a black base coat. So off camera, I sprayed these two glowing candle flames, and you can see there's a pretty distinct difference between the two. Now, color-wise, these are virtually identical. There is one color in the left panel that is not in the right, and there's one color in the right panel that is not in the left. But other than that, the colors are identical. The difference is how I sprayed them out. The panel on the left, I used the same technique that I used when I was spraying urethanes, which is essentially the same technique that Mike LaValle teaches. Mike LaValle is the guy that pioneered this technique. He's still the best at it, in my opinion. But it goes to show you that just because one technique works really well with one product, it doesn't necessarily mean it will translate into another product. When you paint fire, you want it to be glowing, bright, vibrant. You want it jumping out and grabbing your attention. You don't get that effect on the right side of the panel. So from here, I'll throw up another panel, and then I'll show you guys how I achieve this effect. All right, I've got a new panel put up, and you can see a photographic reference hanging here. As we move through this process, I will talk about some of the problems and the issues that I see when people are trying to recreate realistic fire with their airbrush. One of the biggest problems I see is people are trying to wing it. You can't make this stuff up and pull it off convincingly unless you've done a lot of these paint jobs. You need some kind of a photographic reference. It's not hard to find. I used a search engine on the internet and typed in pictures of fire. Found one that I liked and I printed it off. I'm not saying you need to paint this exactly as what you see in the photograph, but it gives you a reference. You can see the shapes, the patterns, how it fades in and out, where the hot spots are, where the darker spots are. That's all valuable information when it comes to pulling this effect off and making it a convincing looking fire. I begin by spraying directly on the panel, and I start with Createx Illustration Scarlet Red. I like the Scarlet Red because it's a little bit brighter shade of red compared to the reds that you can get in the Illustration line, the Wicked line, or the Auto Air line. Now, I have some students that are a little apprehensive about spraying directly onto the panel to begin sketching out the design. The thing is, at this stage, you don't need to worry about messing up. If you get something, a line on here somewhere that you don't like, you can always come back with a black and erase it very easily. So there's no reason to be apprehensive about going ahead and sketching out the design on the panel. It takes a little while for the Scarlet Red to build up, and you'll notice that I'm not going to use any stencils at this stage. I'm not even trying to make this look like fire at this stage. I just want to give myself a rough sketch of where the fire is going to be on this panel. And again, the opaque qualities in the water-based paint are just not comparable to urethane. So this takes a while to build up. Take your time, work in light layers, use the air from your airbrush to dry in between, and eventually this scarlet red will build to a nice bright red. So I'm pretty happy with that from this point, and it doesn't really look like much right now. It's just kind of blobs of red, but you saw it takes a little bit of patience. It takes some time to really build the value of this scarlet red up to the point where I want it. And it's still a little bit muted because we're painting over black. If this had been a urethane, it would have covered beautifully. It would be a super bright red, but with water-based colors, you just have to work things a little bit different. So this will be the very background of the fire. Now to really kind of make this glow, I'm going to share one of my little tricks or secrets, whatever you want to call it. Now I'm going to come in with Auto Air Pearlized Red and just put a little bit of pearl red over the scarlet red. And I'm not so much concerned about like this section here because a lot of this is going to be painted over with further layers of flames. But I want to hit the outskirts because that will give it just a little bit of a glow, especially when it hits good light or the sun. Now you won't really see the effect this pearl gives until you put clear coat over the top of it. But once the clear goes on, it's got almost a glow around the outskirts of the fire and a little bit of a color shift when it's in the sunlight. So it's a pretty cool effect. So that's good with the pearl red. It doesn't take very much at all. You want just enough to allow the color to shift when it's in the sun, but you don't want to overpower it. Later we'll actually come in with a Candy₂O and tint this back just a hair. But from this point, I'm going to start working in some Createx Illustration Orange. I didn't mention this earlier, but as far as reduction goes with the illustration and even the pearl red, I'm probably around 3 or 4 to 1 on my reduction ratio. The illustration paints don't require as much reduction as the Wicked or the Auto Air when you're using an airbrush. You can almost spray a lot of them straight out of the bottle. So I'm using about probably 3 or 4 parts paint to 1 part of reducer, and I'm using the 4012 reducer. So from this point, I'll introduce the orange and I'll start building in a little bit of detail, but we're not really going to start tightening things up until the next step. I may introduce a stencil here and there, but it won't be a lot. And that brings me to another issue I see routinely when I see people airbrushing realistic fire. They'll either use the same stencil over and over and over again, or the same shapes. Nature is very chaotic. You're not going to see the same shapes over and over and over all over this panel. So whether you buy stencils, whether you make your own stencils, you can cut them out of paper or cardstock, whatever you want, but don't just make one. Make 5 or 6 and use them sparingly. So now we'll get into the orange. And there you see me introduce a stencil for the first time. But it's important that you guys realize I use them very sparingly at this stage. We start out very loose and then gradually tighten things up as we progress. And I don't mean to sound repetitive, but the red we've laid down is essentially our roadmap to what we're going to do from here on out. So while working this orange in, because the water-based paint takes so long to cover, I want to stay confined within the red that we've already established. I don't want to come outside of the red and add additional flame wicks like you can with the urethane, because it takes so much effort to get the paint to cover at full saturation. I don't want to cover all of the red that we have. I want to leave a little bit of a halo so you can still see that red in the end, but I want to keep the orange confined within the red as much as possible. So this is starting to take shape. You might notice I'm not going for photorealism here. If I were doing that, I'd be trying to duplicate the reference almost exactly. I'm using the reference as a reference. I'm using it for different shapes, the way that the fire fades in and out, and the highlights, things of that nature. This is still very stylized. Although we're going for a realistic effect, or the illusion of real fire, it's still very stylized in nature. In fact, if you look at this lick right here, it sort of resembles a flame lick from an old school flame job. So there are no rules to this, guys. You can do what you want. From this point, I'm going to come in with the illustration white and really start punching in some detail and some highlights that will get pushed back later. From this point on, I want to try to stay within what I've already got painted. That will make it easier to build the layers brighter, more vibrant, to catch your attention. I may come outside of it just a little bit here and there, but for the most part, the goal is to try and stay within what we've already got. So I'll mix up some illustration white and we'll go to work. You will notice that I use a lot more freehand shields to create sharp edges at this stage, but it's still a balance between those sharp edges and your freehand strokes. You need a balance of both to pull this effect off convincingly. Also notice that I'm leaving voids or gaps between some of these highlights or the flame licks that I'm creating. That's another element that is crucial to pulling this effect off. If you try to connect every highlight or every flame lick, you'll kill the effect. You need those voids to let the fire breathe. And all of this information is coming from my photographic reference. Although I'm not painting this panel to look just like the photograph, I'm taking bits and pieces from that reference and using it to develop my own flame licks, the way they fade in and out and the way the highlights are. All that information is going into this panel. It's also probably worth mentioning that I do own the R-Tool Mike LaValle TrueFire stencil set. I chose not to use any of those stencils in this video simply to illustrate to you guys that you can pull this effect off with just about any shapes. The key is to use them sparingly and try not to repeat the same patterns over and over again. I think that's pretty good for the first stage of the white. A couple things to point out. You don't want to come in too heavy and bury the previous layers, the red and the orange that we've already laid down. If you pay attention to your reference, fire has a very translucent appearance in a lot of areas. You can see through a lot of these flame licks, and some of them just fade off into nothing. So you want to emulate what you see in the reference. If you come in too heavy and just bury all this, it's not going to look right. So notice I've used, in some areas I've used a stencil to get a very sharp edge, but then I fade that white off to where you can still see the underlying colors. Some areas it just fades off into nothing. I also like to use a lot of freehand strokes. I think that adds to the realistic effect of it. So from here, I'll come in with illustration yellow and we'll tint all this white to a yellow. Now it's starting to look a little bit more like fire. The reason I use the illustration yellow in that last stage versus a Candy₂O yellow is because I'm going to come back with white next. The Candy₂O will bleed into the white and the results just aren't as stark. You don't get the super bright highlights that I want. So I'll come in with the Candy₂O later. I initially used the illustration yellow so that I don't have to worry about a candy bleed. So now I'll come back in with white, punch out some really hot spots, and we'll go from there. To clarify my decision to use illustration yellow rather than a Candy₂O yellow in the previous step, You can use a Candy₂O if you prefer and avoid bleeding issues with the use of a product like the 4040 bleed checker. The issue for me personally comes down to efficiency. If I use a coat or two of the 4040 bleed checker, in order for that to form a barrier that will prevent candy bleeding, you need to allow that to cure for 30 minutes to an hour. That slows me down. By using the illustration yellow, as soon as I'm done spraying the illustration yellow, I can come back in with the white and punch out some of these highlights. So it's a personal choice. As far as these highlights, you can see that I'm punching out some of the hot spots that we had created in previous steps. But if you pay attention when I get to the lower left corner of the panel, I'll actually add a few more licks. Not very many, it doesn't take much. And you want to keep those translucent so that you can still see the underlying layers. I also want to try and overlap those new flame licks. That's what gives you the depth and adds realism to the piece. Keep in mind with the second pass of your white that the same rules apply. You still want to keep a translucent value to some of the flames. It's okay to have some hot spots that are opaque, but you still want to be able to see through parts of it. And less is more. You can go really crazy with this and just kill your design. So from here, now I'll start using the Candy₂Os and tinting everything to the values and the tones that I want in the end. So I'm going to start with the Candy₂O Tequila Yellow. And with this Tequila Yellow, I don't want to drown out all the white. Some of this I want to keep as a highlight or a hotter spot in the fire. So I'll work around it. And by work around it, I mean I want to use a very light glaze. I'm not going for full saturation. I want the hot spots to remain brighter than the rest of the fire. Same thing with the Candy₂O Grabber Orange. If I want to push a few of these areas back or tint it more to an orange than a yellow, then we can come in with the Grabber Orange. I'll put a little bit in here. I'm not going to go overboard. I'm pretty happy with where it's at now, but I'll use a little bit of the Grabber Orange. And again, I'm using this orange just to tint some of the areas around the hotter yellow flame licks to push them back, and that adds to the depth and dimension. The last Candy₂O color I'm going to use is blood red. And all I'm going to do is kind of go around the edges where I had the pearl red, just to tint that back just a little bit darker so it's not quite so overpowering when it is in the sun. And mixing the Candy₂O colors is a slightly different process compared to the illustration colors. For more on that, you can check out my Airbrushing with Candy₂O Part 1 video. You can continue to work this until you're happy with it, but remember when you're working with Candy₂Os that each subsequent coat you put on will darken it and darken it and darken it. So keep that in mind. But you can even go to the extent of, off camera I actually tweaked this a little bit more, and I went back to the base coat, which is just Wicked Detail Black, and erased some of the areas that I wasn't happy with, including tailing off some areas. So you're only limited to your imagination. But remember, use your stencils, but use them sparingly. You need freehand work in there as well to really pull off the effect. But that's pretty much it. That's essentially how I do TrueFire with the water-based paints and the Candy₂O. So you know the colors I use, the sequence that I use them in, and that's the result that you can get. So I'll leave links in the description below to all the products that I used in this video. I hope you guys got something out of this. If you did, remember to like, subscribe, and share. I'll see you guys next time.